I never imagined that helping a neighbor replace a set of brake pads on a quiet Saturday morning would somehow turn into a legal battle with my homeowners association. But that's exactly what happened. And by the time it was over, the same people who proudly fined me $700 ended up paying nearly twice that amount just because they thought the rules applied to everyone except themselves. Looking back now, I still smile every time I pull my toolbox out of the garage, because that little concrete driveway taught me something my father used to say all the time. If someone insists on digging a hole for you, don't stop them. Just hand them a bigger shovel. My name is Ethan Walker, and a few years ago I lived in a neighborhood outside Henderson, Nevada, one of those places where every house looked like it had been copied and pasted down the street. Beige stucco walls, tidy little lawns, matching mailboxes, and an HOA that believed every blade of grass was somehow their personal responsibility. Honestly, I never cared much about any of that. I paid my dues on time, kept my yard clean, waved at my neighbors, and stayed out of everybody's business. If you asked people who lived on my street what they knew about me, most of them would have shrugged and said, "That's Ethan, the guy who's always fixing somebody's car." Cars had been part of my life since I was 12 years old. My dad owned a tiny repair shop back in Oklahoma, and before I was old enough to drive, I already knew how to change oil, replace alternators, and rebuild carburetors. I never became a mechanic professionally. Instead, I ended up working as a maintenance supervisor for a hotel chain, but I never lost the habit of spending weekends with grease on my hands. To me, fixing a car wasn't work. It was relaxing. Some people golfed. Some people watched football all weekend. I liked opening the garage door, turning on old country music, and figuring out why somebody's pickup refused to start. Before long, neighbors started asking for little favors. Mrs. Delgado across the street needed a dead battery replaced. Ryan, from 2 houses down, couldn't figure out why his truck squealed every time he hit the brakes. The newly married couple around the corner had a flat tire and no clue how to use the jack that came with their SUV. I'd help every one of them, and every single time they'd ask what they owed me, I'd laugh and tell them the same thing. Just bring cold lemonade next time. That became kind of a neighborhood joke. On Saturday mornings, you'd see 2 or 3 cars sitting in my driveway. Somebody holding a flashlight, another guy handing me a wrench, kids riding bicycles up and down the cul-de-sac, while burgers cooked on a little charcoal grill nearby. It never felt like work. It felt like the kind of neighborhood people always say they miss nowadays. Then one Thursday afternoon, everything changed. I came home from work and found a white envelope taped to my front door. At first, I figured it was another community newsletter reminding us about holiday decorations or trash can rules. Instead, I unfolded 3 pages of legal language with the HOA logo stamped across the top. According to them, I'd been operating an unauthorized commercial automotive repair business from my garage. They demanded immediate payment of a $700 fine and warned that additional penalties would follow if I continued. I actually laughed out loud standing there on my porch. My dog Baxter looked up at me like I had lost my mind. I read the letter again, then a third time. Commercial business? What commercial business? Nobody had ever paid me a dime. I didn't advertise. I didn't have customers. Half the time I ended up buying replacement bolts with my own money because I knew somebody couldn't afford another trip to the parts store. There wasn't a single receipt with my name on it because there wasn't any business to begin with, so I called the number at the bottom of the notice. After sitting through several minutes of hold music, a woman answered. Silver Ridge Community Association. This is Melissa. Her voice sounded practiced, almost robotic. I explained that I had received the violation notice and assumed there had been some misunderstanding. She interrupted before I even finished. Mr. Walker, multiple observations indicate repeated vehicle repair activity on your property. I asked a simple question. Can you point me to the rule that says I can't help my neighbor replace brake pads? She paused for only a second before reading directly from the handbook. No commercial enterprise shall be conducted from any residential property. Exactly, I replied. Commercial. Where's the money? Show me one invoice, one advertisement, one customer. Another pause. Then she simply repeated, "The frequency of activity suggests commercial use." That sentence stuck with me. Suggests, not proves. Suggests. When I hung up, I had a strange feeling in my stomach. It wasn't anger yet. It was curiosity. Somebody had clearly been watching my house long enough to count how often people stopped by. And somehow that bothered me a whole lot more than the fine itself. I didn't know it then, but that uncomfortable feeling was about to lead me straight into the biggest mistake the HOA would ever make. And they had absolute no idea they had already left a trail that would eventually cost them far more than $700. The next couple of days, I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it. Maybe somebody had misunderstood what they saw. Maybe a board member drove past on a Saturday and jumped to conclusions. Maybe this whole thing would disappear if I simply showed up at the hearing and explained myself like two reasonable adults having a conversation. That's what I wanted to believe anyway. Then, on Monday morning, I stepped outside to grab the newspaper and noticed a black Ford Explorer parked halfway down the block. Nothing unusual about that except the engine was running, and when I glanced in its direction, the driver lowered something that looked suspiciously like a camera with a long lens. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just stared for another second before slowly pulling away. It felt strange enough that I mentioned it to my next-door neighbor, Carl, while we were both dragging our trash cans back inside. He shrugged at first, then his expression changed. "Funny you mention that," he said. "I've seen that SUV twice this week. Thought maybe somebody was casing houses." We laughed about it for all of 30 seconds before moving on with our day, but the image stayed with me. 3 days later, another envelope arrived, thicker this time. Inside were half a dozen glossy photographs spread across several pages. There I was kneeling beside Ryan's pickup while replacing a brake rotor. Another picture showed Mrs. Delgado handing me a glass of lemonade. One photo had my toolbox sitting open beside the garage. The HOA had carefully labeled every image with dates and times, as if they'd uncovered some massive criminal operation. Across the top of the report, someone had typed, "Evidence of ongoing commercial automotive services." I should have been furious, but honestly I just sat at my kitchen table shaking my head. Whoever prepared that report clearly didn't know the difference between a neighborhood barbecue and repair shop. Then I looked closer, really closer. One photograph showed the reflection of my garage door and the chrome bumper of Ryan's truck. I knew exactly where Ryan had parked that day because I'd asked him to pull farther into the driveway so another neighbor could still get around the cul-de-sac. That angle wasn't possible from the sidewalk. It wasn't possible from the street either. Somebody had walked several feet onto my driveway to take that picture. Another image looked directly over my shoulder while I worked beneath an open hood. Whoever took it would have had to stand practically next to my toolbox. I pushed every photograph across the table and lined them up. The farther I looked, the worse it became. They hadn't simply watched from public property. They'd entered my driveway over and over again. My first instinct was to march into the HOA office and demand answers. But the more I thought about it, the calmer I became. Anger makes people sloppy. Patience makes people dangerous. That evening, I called someone I hadn't spoken with in several months, my old college roommate, Daniel Harper. We met freshman year because we were the only two guys in the dorm who stayed awake arguing over court cases instead of football games. I went into maintenance. Daniel became a property attorney, and somewhere along the way he developed a reputation for knowing HOA law better than some board presidents. After I emailed him the violation letters and photographs, he called back less than an hour later. "Forget the fine for a second," he said. "Tell me exactly where you think those pictures were taken." I walked him through each one. He stayed quiet for a long moment before asking another question. "Did you ever give anyone permission to enter your driveway?" "No." "Good," he answered. "Don't contact them again. Let them keep talking." That wasn't the advice I expected. But Daniel had a habit of seeing 3 moves ahead. The following week, he filed a formal discovery request demanding every document connected to the investigation, including surveillance records, contractor invoices, field notes, communication between the board and their security company, everything. I figured the HOA would object or refuse. Instead, they proudly handed it over, probably convinced the paperwork would strengthen their case. It was one of the biggest legal mistakes I've ever seen. A few days later, Daniel invited me to his office. He spread a stack of documents across his conference table and started highlighting lines with a yellow marker. "Read this one," he said. I looked down. Surveillance log. April 14. Investigator entered driveway for close-range vehicle documentation. Another entry. May 2nd. Walked approximately 12 feet onto property for unobstructed angle. Another. Subject approached garage. Investigator retreated to vehicle. There were 6 separate entries describing employees physically entering my property. 6. Daniel leaned back in his chair with the smallest grin I'd ever seen. "Congratulations," he said. "They just documented trespassing for us." I laughed because the whole thing sounded ridiculous. "You're telling me they wrote down their own mistakes?" "Not just wrote them down," he replied. "They timestamped them." That's when the entire case shifted in my mind. Until then, I've been trying to prove I wasn't running a business. Now I realized I didn't have to. They had created a much bigger problem for themselves. Every single photograph they planned to use had been collected through unlawful entry onto private property. Daniel explained that even if they believed they were enforcing community rules, that didn't magically give contractors permission to walk onto someone's property whenever they felt like it. Rules don't erase property rights. I left his office feeling lighter than I had in weeks, but I also understood something else. This wasn't really about me anymore. If they were willing to step into my driveway without permission, how many other homeowners had they done the same thing to? The hearing arrived 2 weeks later. The HOA clubhouse conference room looked exactly like you'd expect. Polished wood table, bottled water lined up in neat rows, framed photos of community landscaping hanging on the walls, as if they belonged in an art museum. 3 board members sat together while Melissa occupied the chair closest to the projector. She smiled politely when I walked in, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile people wear when they're convinced they've already won. The security contractor sat near the back with a laptop. Daniel whispered, "Relax. Let them go first." The chairman called the meeting to order, and Melissa immediately launched into a rehearsed presentation. Slide after slide showed photographs of cars parked in my driveway. She described repeated repair activity, frequent visitors, visible tools, and what she called a pattern consistent with unauthorized commercial operations. Every sentence sounded polished, but every conclusion rested on assumptions instead of facts. When she finally finished, the chairman looked at Daniel. "Your response?" Daniel stood without hurry. "I'd like to ask just a few questions." He turned toward Melissa. "Did Mr. Walker ever advertise automotive services?" "Not that we're aware of." "Did you discover a business license?" "No." "Any invoices?" "No." "Tax records?" "No." "Bank deposits?" "No." "Any witness who claims they paid him?" Silence. Daniel nodded slowly as though each answer confirmed exactly what he expected. "So the association has absolutely no evidence that my client operated a business." Melissa shifted in her chair. The volume of activity suggested. Daniel raised one finger. Suggested. "Thank you. Now let's discuss how you gathered your suggestions." He reached into his briefcase and placed a binder on the table. I recognized the surveillance logs immediately. The room suddenly felt smaller. The security contractor stopped smiling. Melissa looked confused for just a second before realizing exactly which documents Daniel was holding. That tiny change in her face told me everything. She knew what was coming, and for the first time since this mess started, the confidence I'd seen in the HOA board completely disappeared. Daniel waited until the room was completely quiet before opening the binder. He didn't raise his voice, didn't try to put on a performance. He simply slid one photocopy page across the table toward the board president and said, "Would you please read the highlighted sentence out loud?" The president adjusted his glasses, frowned for a moment, then reluctantly read, "Investigator entered homeowner's driveway to obtain close-range photographs at 10:18 a.m. Daniel nodded. "Thank you. Now the next page." Another pause. walked approximately 12 feet onto property for unobstructed documentation. Then another, and another. By the fourth log entry, nobody was reading confidently anymore. The security contractor had folded his arms and stared at the floor while Melissa looked like she wished the carpet would open beneath her chair. Daniel finally closed the binder and looked directly at the board. Every photograph you presented today was obtained after your contractor admitted, in writing, that he entered private property without permission. Those admissions came from your own records, not my client. Nobody spoke. You could hear the air conditioner humming above us. The chairman finally cleared his throat. Our understanding was that the contractor remained within acceptable observation areas. Daniel calmly shook his head. Your understanding doesn't change what your own logs say. Property rights don't disappear because someone serves on an HOA board. Melissa tried one last time to regain control. The association's intention was simply to enforce community standards. Daniel answered without missing a beat. Intent doesn't legalize trespassing, and assumptions don't create a business. Then he turned toward me. Ethan, have you ever accepted payment for repairing a neighbor's vehicle? No. Have you ever advertised? Never. Do you own a business license? No. Did you ever invite the investigator onto your property? I looked straight at the board before answering. Absolutely not. That was the moment everything changed. The hearing officer leaned back in his chair, flipped through the documents for another minute, then removed his glasses. The association has failed to demonstrate that the homeowner operated a commercial enterprise, he said. Furthermore, the evidence presented was obtained through repeated unauthorized entry onto private property, making it fundamentally unreliable for enforcement purposes. Just like that, the $700 fine disappeared. But the hearing officer wasn't finished. He ordered the HOA to permanently delete every photograph and surveillance record collected from my property, prohibited any future investigative entry without lawful authorization, and directed the association to reimburse my legal expenses in full. By the time everything was calculated, they owed me just over $1,200, nearly twice what they'd tried to take from me in the first place. You would have thought losing the case would be embarrassing enough, but the fallout inside the neighborhood turned out to be even worse for the board. Within a week, the private security company lost its contract after several homeowners started asking uncomfortable questions about whether their properties had been entered too. At the next monthly association meeting, attendance was higher than I'd ever seen. People weren't yelling. They were asking questions, real questions. Who authorized the surveillance? How many homes had been photographed? Were dues being used to spy on residents instead of maintaining the community? The board suddenly found itself defending its own decisions instead of policing everyone else's. Melissa never apologized. She didn't have to. Every time we crossed paths after that, she'd lower her eyes and keep walking, which honestly said more than any apology ever could. The Black Explorer vanished from the neighborhood and never came back. Saturdays slowly returned to normal. Carl brought over his old Silverado for new brake pads. Mrs. Delgado still showed up with homemade lemonade. Ryan joked that I should frame the reimbursement check and hang it on the garage wall right above my toolbox. Maybe I should have. Instead, I folded it up, deposited it at the bank, and got back to living my life. Looking back now, I realized the biggest lesson had nothing to do with the money. $700 would have been frustrating, sure, but I could have paid it and moved on. What bothered me was the idea that someone believed they could ignore the same rules they expected everyone else to follow. Respect isn't built to intimidation. Communities aren't strengthened by surveillance. And power, no matter how small, has a funny way of convincing people they're untouchable, right up until someone calmly asks them to prove they're actually right. My father used to tell me that good neighbors solve problems with conversations, while bad leaders create problems with assumptions. I didn't fully understand what he meant until all of this happened. I never wanted revenge. I never wanted to embarrass anyone. I simply wanted to be left alone to help my neighbors the same way my father taught me years ago. The funny part is, if the HOA had simply knocked on my door, instead of sending investigators onto my driveway, none of this would have happened. So now I'm curious what you think. Did the HOA have a legitimate reason to investigate repeated car repairs? Or did they cross a line the moment they stepped onto private property without permission? And if you were sitting in that hearing room, would you have ruled the same way? Let me know your thoughts in the comments because stories like this always spark some interesting debates. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's ever had an HOA think it had just a little too much authority. You never know. They might have a story that's even crazier than mine.